Racist cop assaults black U.S. Army general, instantly wishes he hadn't. What if the quiet respect a man had earned through a lifetime of service could be stripped away in a single moment, just because of the color of his skin? It was late afternoon when General Marcus Hale stepped out of his car, his uniform pressed, his medals catching the faint glow of the setting sun. He wasn't a man who sought attention. He carried himself with the quiet dignity that comes from years of sacrifice and discipline. But in that instant, outside a small-town diner, his world collided with someone who refused to see the man, only the skin he wore. The sound of gravel crunching beneath approaching boots, the sharp bark of a voice that carried accusation instead of respect. It was a moment that would change everything. "Where are you watching from tonight?" The town of Clearbrook sat quiet that evening, its streets lined with maple trees, just beginning to show the first colors of fall. General Marcus Hale had come here for the simplest of reasons. He had driven nearly 2 hours to visit his daughter, Lena, who taught history at the local high school. For Marcus, time with family was a rare gift after decades of deployments overseas, endless training schedules, and brief stints at home that always ended too soon. Retirement was on the horizon, and though he still wore the stars on his shoulders with pride, he longed for the days when his time belonged not to the army, but to his loved ones. That evening, Marcus had promised Lena dinner. Nothing fancy, just a small-town diner where the waitresses knew the farmers by name, and the jukebox still worked if you tapped it on the side. He smiled at the thought of sharing a plate of meatloaf and mashed potatoes with his daughter, listening to her stories about her students. Lena was 36, spirited, with her mother's sharp wit and his steady patience. She always said he looked at her like a soldier listening to a battle plan, attentive to every detail, and it made her laugh. He parked his car across the street from the diner, stepping out with his cap tucked under his arm. His uniform wasn't for show. He'd come straight from a meeting at the nearby base, where he was helping shape a transition program for younger soldiers returning to civilian life. The uniform was second nature, stitched into his skin after so many years. Across the lot, a patrol car idled. Marcus didn't pay it much attention at first. Clearbrook wasn't a place of tension. It was the kind of town where neighbors waved to one another, where folks left their doors unlocked during the day. But the car door slammed, sharp and loud, and a young officer strode across the street. His hand hovered near his belt, his steps hard against the gravel. "Hey, you!" The officer barked, his voice carrying an edge of authority sharpened by something colder. "What are you doing here?" Marcus turned, steady, calm. He had faced harder stares in deserts far from home. "I'm heading in for dinner," he said, his tone polite, measured. The officer's eyes narrowed. "Don't get smart with me. Let's see some ID." Marcus frowned slightly, confused but composed. "Officer, I haven't done anything wrong. I'm just meeting my daughter." He motioned toward the diner, where through the window he could see Lena waving from a booth. But the officer didn't look toward the window. His gaze stayed fixed, hard, unyielding. "ID, now!" There was a shift in the air. Diners inside had begun to notice, forks pausing mid-air, conversations dropping to whispers. Marcus felt the sting of something he hadn't experienced in years, something he thought his uniform shielded him from. Raw suspicion painted on his skin. He reached slowly into his breast pocket, pulling out his military ID, his movements deliberate, the same way he had taught young soldiers to move carefully during tense patrols overseas. "Here," he said quietly, offering the card. The officer snatched it, glanced at it for barely a second, and scoffed. "That's not what I asked for." "Driver's license." Marcus exhaled slowly, the weight of the moment pressing on his chest. "With all due respect, my military ID is valid identification. It's issued by the United States government." The officer stepped closer, the scent of aftershave mixing with the faint tang of metal. "I said driver's license. Don't make me repeat myself." Inside the diner, Lena rose to her feet, her hands pressed to the glass, eyes wide with fear. Marcus gave the smallest shake of his head, a silent command to stay back. She had grown up watching him handle tense situations with calm authority, and now she saw that same resolve etched in his features. Still, the officer's tone grew sharper. "Hands on the hood of the car. Now!" The words struck like a slap. Marcus stood frozen for a beat, his chest tightening, his medals glinting under the neon diner sign. He had commanded battalions, briefed presidents, comforted widows of fallen soldiers, but here in his own country, in a quiet town, he was nothing more to this man than a threat. "Officer," Marcus said, his voice low but firm. "I've done nothing to warrant this." The officer's hand twitched near his holster. "You resisting?" The night grew heavy with silence. Even the jukebox inside the diner seemed to hush. Marcus knew the weight of escalation, knew the danger of one wrong move. He had counseled young privates about restraint, about never letting anger decide their actions. Now those lessons became his lifeline. "I'm not resisting," Marcus said, and slowly with dignity he placed his hands on the cool metal of his car's hood. A gasp rippled through the diner. Lena pushed open the door, rushing outside despite her father's warning glance. "He's my father," she shouted, her voice breaking. "He's a general in the United States Army." The officer sneered. "Doesn't matter." "Out here he follows my orders." The tension crackled, a storm ready to break. Marcus felt the sting of humiliation burn deeper than the cool autumn air. Yet beneath it there was a deeper ache, a question gnawing at him. How many others had faced this without a uniform to lend them even a sliver of protection? As Lena pleaded, a small crowd began to gather on the sidewalk. Phones were raised, the faint glow of screens recording every second. The officer, caught in his own rising pride, didn't seem to notice or didn't care, and in that moment, with cameras rolling and whispers spreading, Marcus Hale's quiet dinner with his daughter became something else entirely. A test of dignity, a battle not fought with rifles or tactics, but with restraint, courage, and the unyielding demand for respect. The story was no longer his alone. It had become a reflection of something larger, something this small town, and soon the country would be forced to reckon with. The hum of voices swelled as more townspeople drifted toward the diner, drawn by the sight of flashing phones and the unmistakable tension of something gone terribly wrong. Marcus Hale, his palms resting against the cold steel of his own car, stood still as stone. Years of training had taught him that in moments like this, movement could be mistaken for menace, words twisted into defiance. Yet still, his heart pounded with a rhythm he hadn't felt since combat zones far across the ocean. "Dad!" Lena cried again, her voice slicing through the crisp evening air. "This is insane. He hasn't done anything." She tried to approach, but the officer swung his arm out, blocking her path. "Ma'am, step back or you'll be detained too," he barked, the edge in his tone sharp enough to cut glass. Marcus turned his head slightly, enough to catch her eyes. "Lena," he said softly, steady as a mountain, "do what he says, please." It was a father's command, not out of fear, but out of the unshakable instinct to shield his child from harm. His daughter stopped, trembling, torn between obedience and outrage. The officer reached for his radio, his voice clipped. "Unit 12 requesting backup. Possible non-compliant suspect." Those words, spoken without hesitation, spread like poison. Marcus felt the sting in his chest. Non-compliant suspect. He had given 35 years of his life to protect a country that now branded him with suspicion because of a uniform he wasn't wearing. His skin. From the corner of his eye, he saw the red glow of another phone screen. A teenager in a baseball cap whispered to his friend. "He's a general," she said. "Why's the cop treating him like that?" The friend shook his head. "Doesn't matter to him, man. He doesn't see that." The murmurs grew louder, a chorus of disbelief mixing with the officer's growing frustration. He stepped closer, pressing a hand to Marcus's shoulder, pushing him harder against the hood. "Spread your legs, now!" Marcus gritted his teeth, the metal cold beneath his fingertips. "Officer," he said quietly, "what you're doing isn't right." The shove came harder this time. I said, "Spread your legs." Gasps rippled through the crowd. Lena covered her mouth with her hand, her eyes filling with tears. She couldn't reconcile the man who had tucked her in at night, who had taught her to ride a bike, who had walked her down the aisle at her wedding, being shoved like a criminal in front of strangers. One of the bystanders stepped forward, a middle-aged woman clutching a grocery bag. "Excuse me, officer," she said, her voice shaky but brave. "That man served this country. I recognize him. He was in the paper last year for a veterans ceremony. You need to let him go." The officer whipped around, his face flushed. "Ma'am, step back before you obstruct a police investigation." But the crowd was no longer passive. Voices rose, questions fired like arrows. "Why are you treating him like that?" "He showed you his ID." "That's General Hale. Everyone knows him." The officer's jaw tightened, his grip on Marcus firm, but doubt flickered in his eyes. He had expected compliance, not resistance, from witnesses. Yet pride held him captive, the kind of pride that turns wrong into defiance. At that moment, headlights swept across the lot. Another patrol car pulled in, tires crunching over gravel. A second officer emerged, older, heavier, his hand resting near his belt, but his expression wary. "What's going on here?" The younger cop straightened, pointing at Marcus. "Non-compliant suspect. Refused orders. Might be carrying false ID." The older officer's brow furrowed. He stepped closer, taking the military ID still clenched in the young cop's fist. He turned it over, his eyes scanning the name, the rank, the etched symbols of a life spent in service. And then he looked at Marcus's face, really looked, and recognition dawned. "General Hale?" he asked, his tone shifting, almost reverent. Marcus inclined his head, his voice calm, though the weight in his chest pressed heavy. "That's correct." The crowd hushed, waiting, tension thick as molasses. The older officer's eyes flicked to the younger one. "You didn't recognize him?" "He could have been lying," the younger officer muttered, his voice defensive. "Lying." The older officer snapped. "That man has more honor in his little finger than most of us could dream of." The younger cop's face darkened, his pride pierced in front of the crowd. But still, he clung to his authority like a drowning man to driftwood. Protocol says you treat people with respect," the older officer interrupted firmly. "Especially when they've done nothing wrong." A murmur of agreement swept through the onlookers. Some clapped softly, others whispered words of encouragement. Lena rushed forward, finally free to embrace her father. Marcus closed his eyes as her arms wrapped around him, the warmth of her touch cutting through the cold humiliation still clinging to him. The twist of the evening settled like a stone in Marcus's heart. In one careless moment, his dignity had been stripped bare for all to see, and yet, because of witnesses, because of the truth of who he was, it would not stay hidden. The videos captured every shove, every word, every choice, and as Marcus stood tall once more, adjusting the brim of his cap with deliberate grace, he realized this was no longer a private wound. It was a story now, one that would ripple far beyond this diner lot. A story that might just force a reckoning. If this moment touched your heart, the narrator's voice would have said, "Please give the video a thumbs up." The story was only beginning. Even after the older officer's intervention, the sting of humiliation clung to Marcus like smoke after a fire. He stood in the gravel lot, his daughter's arm looped through his, but inside he felt a hollowness he couldn't quite name. It wasn't just about himself. It was about every young soldier he had mentored, every man and woman who believed that the uniform was a shield of honor, that their sacrifice would be seen, valued, respected. That night, back at Lena's house, Marcus sat at her kitchen table, the smell of her homemade chili lingering in the air. She had tried to lighten the evening with food, as she always did, but even her laughter felt heavy, forced. "Dad," she said softly, "you can't just let this go. People saw what happened. The whole town's talking about it." Marcus stared at the steam rising from his bowl, his spoon untouched. "I've spent my life teaching young men restraint," he murmured, "to hold their fire until the last possible moment. To measure their choices not in pride, but in discipline. If I push too hard now, I risk proving his point, that I was troubled, that I was defiant." Lena reached across the table, covering his hand with hers. "No, Dad, you showed restraint. Everyone saw that. What they saw was him crossing the line, not you. Marcus looked into his daughter's eyes and saw the reflection of his late wife, strong and unyielding in her quiet wisdom. He thought of the photo that always traveled with him, tucked in his wallet. His wife smiling at a picnic years ago, Lena still a teenager beside her. That photo had been his anchor through wars and separations, a reminder of what waited for him at home. Tonight, it reminded him why dignity mattered, not just for him but for everyone who came after. The next morning, the videos had spread beyond Clearbrook. Local news picked them up, and soon national outlets came calling. The images were clear. A decorated general shoved against his own car, his daughter pleading, a crowd bearing witness. Anchors spoke with solemn tones about respect, race, and the treatment of veterans. Editorials questioned how such a man who had given his life to service could be met with suspicion instead of honor. Marcus tried to avoid the screens, but Lena left the television on, her hands folded tightly in her lap. "They're not going to let this go, Dad," she whispered. By afternoon, Marcus received a call. It was from Colonel Avery, an old friend still serving actively. "Marcus," he said, his voice tight, "we've seen the footage. Command is furious. Not at you, at what happened. You need to speak publicly. People need to hear your voice." Marcus hesitated. "I'm not a politician, Avery. I don't grandstand." "This isn't grandstanding," Avery pressed. "It's about setting the record straight. It's about showing the country what dignity looks like, even in the face of bias. You've always been the man who taught us to rise above. Now the nation needs to see that man again." That night, Marcus lay awake, staring at the ceiling of his daughter's guest room. His medals sat neatly on the dresser, catching the moonlight. For the first time, they felt heavy, almost mocking. What was the value of medals if they couldn't shield a man from suspicion? He thought of the younger soldiers he had guided through reintegration programs, men who bore not just physical scars, but invisible ones, men who worried every time they walked into a store that eyes might follow them, that assumptions might bind them. A memory surfaced unbidden. Years ago, after a deployment, a young private had confessed to him, tears streaming down his face, that he dreaded returning home more than combat. "Sir," the private had said, "over there I knew the enemy. Back home I never know who sees me as one." Marcus closed his eyes, the weight of those words pressing against his chest. Now he understood them more deeply than ever. The turning point came the following day. An invitation arrived from the town council. They were holding an emergency hearing, not just to address the incident, but to discuss the broader issue of policing practices. Community leaders, veterans, and residents would be present. The mayor had personally requested Marcus's attendance. At first he resisted. "I don't want this to be about me," he told Lena, but she countered with quiet resolve. "Dad, it's not about you. It's about what you represent. People trust you. They need to see how you handle this, not with anger, but with the strength you've always carried." He nodded slowly, her words sinking deep. She was right. This wasn't about vengeance or pride. This was about channeling his pain into something constructive, something that could outlast the sting of one humiliating night. At the hearing, the room was packed. Veterans in uniform filled the front row, their ribbons bright against dark jackets. Families sat side by side, some holding small flags, others clutching notebooks. The air was thick with anticipation, the kind that comes when a community knows it's on the brink of change. The younger officer sat stiffly at a table, his jaw clenched, eyes darting to the floor. The older officer stood nearby, solemn and quiet, a silent acknowledgement of what had gone wrong. When Marcus entered, the room rose to its feet, not with applause, but with a respectful silence that carried more weight than any cheer could. He took his seat, his back straight, his cap resting neatly on the table before him. The council chair cleared her throat. "General Hale, thank you for being here. We'd like to hear your account, in your own words." Marcus drew a slow breath, letting the silence linger a moment longer. He looked around the room, at the veterans, at the families, at the officer who had humiliated him, and then he spoke. I have served this country for 35 years, he began, his voice calm but resonant. I have stood in deserts and mountains, in rain and fire, to defend the values we hold dear. And last week, on a quiet street in this very town, I was reminded that service alone does not always shield us from suspicion. I was treated as a threat, not as a man. The room held its breath. But this is not about me, Marcus continued. This is about what kind of country we want to be. Do we honor service only when it suits us? Do we grant dignity only to those who look a certain way? Or do we live up to the principles we claim to defend, that all people are deserving of respect, of fairness, of justice? A hush fell deeper, thick with reflection. Marcus's eyes settled briefly on the young officer. We cannot change what has already happened, but we can change what happens next. That was the moment the tide shifted, not with anger, but with resolve. The council nodded, scribbling notes. The community leaned forward, hungry for a way forward. And in Marcus's quiet dignity, the path began to emerge. If you've ever faced something like this, the narrator might have said softly to viewers, share your experience in the comments below. The turn had come. Now the resolution waited. The council chamber buzzed with whispers after Marcus's words. The chair tapped her gavel gently, calling for order, but the weight of his testimony still hung in the air. Veterans shifted in their seats, some wiping at their eyes. Young men and women leaned forward, their phones still recording. It wasn't the anger of a man wronged that moved them. It was the calm steadiness of someone who refused to let injustice harden his soul. The mayor leaned in toward his microphone. General Hale, on behalf of this town, I want to apologize for what occurred. An independent review has already begun. We intend to be transparent in every step. Marcus nodded, though he felt no triumph. I don't want apologies, he said gently. What I want is accountability. Not vengeance, not spectacle, accountability. The younger officer squirmed in his chair, his face pale. His lawyer, seated beside him, whispered something into his ear, but the officer shook his head stiffly, pride still clinging even as the walls closed in. The council opened the floor for public comment. One by one, residents rose to speak. A retired sergeant with a cane recounted how Marcus had once helped secure funding for the local veterans clinic. A school teacher spoke about her students watching the video and asking her difficult questions about respect and race. A farmer, his hands calloused and rough, said simply, "What I saw that night wasn't right. And if it can happen to him, it can happen to any of us." Each voice added weight, not just to Marcus's story, but to the shared demand for change. This wasn't a crowd whipped into anger. It was a community speaking with one voice, calling for fairness. Finally, the chair turned to the officer. "Officer Daniels, you've heard these accounts. Do you have anything you'd like to say?" For the first time, his bravado faltered. His eyes darted to the crowd, then to Marcus, then down to his hands. He cleared his throat, the sound harsh in the quiet room. I was doing my job," he muttered. The council chair frowned. "Your job is to uphold the law with integrity, not to misuse authority." "Did you feel threatened that night?" Daniels shifted uncomfortably. "He didn't comply right away. I thought he might be hiding something." Marcus held his gaze steadily. "What I was hiding," he said softly, "was my disappointment. Disappointment that a man in uniform could not see another man in uniform as his equal." A ripple ran through the chamber. Daniels flushed, his jaw tightening. Yet the words hung, undeniable. The review panel announced their findings 2 days later. The investigation confirmed what the video showed: excessive force, violation of protocol, failure to de-escalate. Daniels was suspended pending further disciplinary action, with the possibility of termination. But beyond his fate, the town council moved quickly to implement reforms, mandatory de-escalation training, community oversight, and a commitment to greater transparency. Marcus attended the announcement quietly, his cap tucked under his arm. Reporters swarmed him afterward, microphones thrust in his face. "General Hale, do you feel justice has been served?" He paused, choosing his words with care. "Justice is not about one man losing his badge," he said. Justice is about ensuring the next man or woman who walks these streets is met with respect, not suspicion. What happened to me is not unique. But if my voice can help make it less common, then maybe some good can come from this. The clip went viral. Not for its outrage, but for its grace. Across the country, veterans wrote letters of support. Churches prayed for healing. Families at dinner tables debated fairness and reform. At Lena's kitchen table, Marcus sifted through stacks of letters that had begun arriving. Handwritten notes from strangers who saw their own fathers, brothers, or sons in him. One letter stood out. It was from a young black soldier just finishing basic training. "Sir, when I saw you stand tall that night, it gave me hope. Hope that I can wear this uniform and still be seen. Thank you for showing me what strength looks like." Marcus folded the letter carefully, slipping it into the same wallet pocket that carried his wife's photo. It felt like a new anchor, one that tied his private pain to a broader purpose. That night, he and Lena sat on the porch, the crickets chirping softly in the distance. "You didn't just defend yourself, Dad," she said. "You defended all of us." He shook his head gently. "I defended what's right, and sometimes that's harder than fighting any war." The stars glittered overhead. Quiet witnesses to the battles fought not on foreign soil, but in the hearts of men and women striving for dignity. If you've been moved by this journey, a narrator might say to viewers at that moment, subscribe for more heartfelt stories. The resolution had begun, not with thunder or applause, but with the steady steps of accountability, reform, and quiet courage. The weeks that followed were filled with quieter days, though the echoes of that night in Clearbrook lingered across the nation. News cycles moved on, but the town itself carried the memory close, like a scar that would never fully fade. For Marcus Hale, it wasn't about headlines anymore. It was about healing and about what came after the storm. One evening, Marcus walked through the Veterans Center where he had long volunteered. The halls smelled faintly of coffee and floor polish, the bulletin boards cluttered with photos of men and women who had served. Some walked with canes, others carried invisible burdens, but all came here for one reason: to be seen, to be understood. As Marcus stepped into the main room, conversations hushed for a moment. Then one of the younger vets stood, his voice carrying. "General, we saw what you went through. You carried yourself with more strength than most of us knew possible." "Thank you." Marcus inclined his head, humbled. "Strength," he said softly, "isn't about how loud you shout. It's about how steady you stay when the ground shakes beneath you." Afterward, he lingered near a display case filled with medals and old photographs. Among them was a black-and-white image of soldiers returning from World War II, their faces weary but proud. Someone had tucked a handwritten note beside it. "Dignity is not given, it is lived." Marcus traced the words with his eyes, feeling their truth settle deep. That night, back at Lena's house, he sat at the same kitchen table where the ordeal had first weighed on him. Only now the air felt different, lighter somehow. Lena set a small wooden box before him. "This came in the mail for you today," she said. Her smile faint but steady. Inside lay a simple bracelet, braided leather with a small silver plate etched with the words, "Stand Tall." There was no name attached, only a short note. "For the night you showed us all what courage really is." Marcus turned the bracelet in his hands, the leather rough beneath his fingertips, the silver cool. He thought of all the symbolic items he had carried over the years. Dog tags, photographs, campaign patches. This one was different. It wasn't about war. It was about peace, about the fight for dignity at home. He slipped it onto his wrist and felt a quiet sense of closure. Later, sitting on the porch with Lena, the crickets singing and the stars bright above, he allowed himself a rare smile. "Your mother would have scolded me," he said, his tone touched with warmth. "She'd have said I should have spoken out sooner." Lena laughed softly, her eyes glistening. "She would have been proud of you, Dad. I know I am." They sat in silence for a while, the night wrapping around them like an old quilt. The hurt was still there, yes, but it no longer defined the moment. Instead, what lingered was a sense of renewal, a belief that even in brokenness, something stronger could emerge. Across the nation, reforms in small towns echoed Clearbrook's changes. Training programs expanded. Community oversight boards gained traction. It wasn't overnight change, and Marcus knew better than anyone that progress was a slow march, not a sprint. But it was movement, and it mattered. One Sunday morning as he left church with Lena, a stranger approached him. An elderly white man, his hat clutched in his hands, eyes brimming with sincerity. "General Hale," he said quietly, "I just wanted to say I've been thinking a lot since that night. I used to think respect was something you gave only when it was earned. But watching you, I realized sometimes you give respect first, and that's how it's earned in return. You changed the way I see things." Marcus clasped the man's hand, his voice steady. "That's all any of us can ask for, to see each other as people first." As the seasons turned, Marcus began preparing for retirement in earnest. The army would hold a formal ceremony, but he knew the real farewell had already taken place, on a quiet autumn evening in a small-town diner lot, when dignity was tested and truth was revealed. On his final day at the base, Marcus packed away the last of his things. Among the papers and keepsakes was that bracelet, still snug on his wrist. He paused, looking out the office window at the flag waving against a blue sky. He thought of every soldier he had led, every loss, every victory, and every lesson. When he walked out of that office for the last time, he carried no bitterness, only resolve. Resolve that his story would remind others that respect is not optional, and dignity is not negotiable. That evening, he sat once more at Lena's table, his cap resting beside him, the bracelet catching the warm glow of the kitchen light. He lifted his daughter's hand gently, giving it a squeeze. "No matter what, Lena," he said, "you stand tall, even when the world tries to bow your head." She smiled, tears glistening. "I learned that from you, Dad." And with that the story found its peace. Not in anger, not in revenge, but in quiet strength, enduring love, and the simple truth that justice, though sometimes delayed, can still find its way home. So if you've been touched by this story, dear listener, I'd love to hear where you're watching from. Leave a comment, share your thoughts. And if you'd like to hear more stories of dignity, justice, and hope, don't forget to subscribe, because sometimes the stories that change us most aren't about wars overseas, but about the battles fought right here at home, with courage, humility, and the unyielding belief that respect belongs to us all.